Hello, everyone. I'm James Peretta, and my collaborators on this project are Andrew Diorio at the University of Michigan and Arjun Guha and Jonathan Bell at Northeastern University. Our paper examines the use of mutation analysis for evaluating student test suite quality. The motivation behind our study is that teaching software testing is still a critical part of computer science pedagogy, but grading student test suites requires a lot of effort. Our study looks at two common grading scenarios. The first is where an instructor seeds faults by hand into their own implementation, runs each student test suite on those manually seeded faults, and awards points based on the number of faults detected. This gives the instructor full control over the kinds of faults used to evaluate the student tests, but requires manual effort to write the faults. It's also unclear whether faults seeded in the instructor solution are representative of faults in student code, since students are known to solve problems and structure their solutions in fundamentally different ways from experts. Second, there's the all pairs approach, where each student test suite is run on each other student implementation, and points are then awarded based on the number of faulty student implementations detected. Now, this requires significant manual and computational effort to apply fairly and accurately, and the effort to do so scales superlinearly with the number of students. Mutation analysis may provide a means to achieve the same learning goals as these approaches, but with less manual and computational effort. Some prior work examined using mutation analysis to evaluate student-written tests, but there isn't evidence that mutants are a good stand-in for manually seeded faults. Prior work has reached conflicting conclusions on the efficacy of mutation analysis for evaluating student test suites. And there's evidence that mutants are a valid substitute for faults in open source software, but it's unclear if those results apply to student-written code. In particular, it's unclear if the competent programmer hypothesis holds for student code. We conducted a large-scale empirical evaluation to examine whether mutation analysis is an effective means of evaluating student test suites in two grading scenarios, looking to answer the following research questions. 1. Is mutation score a good proxy for manually seeded fault detection rate? And 2, is mutation score a good proxy for faulty student implementation detection rate in an all pairs grading approach? We collected data from 2,711 assignment submissions from 5 programming assignments across 3 courses at different institutions. The assignments used JavaScript, TypeScript, or C++, and we used Striker Mutator as our mutation analysis tool for the JavaScript and TypeScript assignments, and Mull for the C++ assignments. In the first 2 assignments in this table, Game Card and Game Player, students implemented object-oriented classes representing a card in a standard deck of 52 playing cards, and a player in the trick-taking card game Euchre. Students also wrote test cases for those classes. The implementations were evaluated against a suite of instructor-written test cases, and the student-written test suites were evaluated against a set of faults manually seeded by an instructor. Students were allowed to work alone or with a partner, and could receive feedback on their test cases up to 3 times a day from an automated grading system. For these and all the other assignments we collected data from, students were given feedback on the number of manually seeded faults their test suite detected, but not which specific faults their tests detected. In the stable marriage assignment, students wrote test cases for a set of instructor-written implementations of the classic stable marriage algorithm. All the implementations shared a common interface. The students' test cases were evaluated against a set of manually seeded faults, and students could receive feedback as often as they wished from an automated grading system. In the web app assignment, students wrote test cases for an instructor-written implementation of a REST-based web service. Students' test cases were evaluated against a set of manually seeded faults, and students could receive feedback as often as they wished from an automated grading system. And finally, in the sorting assignment, students wrote test cases for a set of instructor-written sorting implementations that share a common interface. These implementations were bubble sort, heap sort, tree sort, quick sort, and merge sort. Students' test cases were evaluated against a set of manually seeded faults, and students could receive feedback up to 5 times a day from an automated grading system. An important aspect of these grading scenarios is guarding against false positives. Otherwise, invalid test cases could cause students to receive a higher score than they actually should. A common strategy to prevent this is to run the student test suite against a correct implementation first. In some course assignments, test cases that displayed false positives, that is, the test case fails when run against a correct implementation, were thrown out, and the remaining valid test cases were run against the faulty implementations. In other course assignments, student tests had to be completely free of false positives to receive any credit. In our data collection, we followed the same approach that was used in the original grading of each assignment. This ensures that we did not discard data overly aggressively. An interesting note here is that there were several instances where we had to add additional assertions to the correct implementation in order to detect additional false positives in the student test cases. We collected mutation scores for each student test suite with mutants generated from an instructor-written implementation. And here on these plots, each dot represents one student-written test suite. The x-axis shows the number of manually seeded faults detected by each test suite, and the y-axis shows the number of mutants detected. We see a strong correlation between the number of manually seeded faults and the number of mutants detected on 4 out of 5 of these assignments. After examining the manually seeded faults from the sorting assignments, where we observed a weak correlation, and discussing those faults with the course staff, it became clear that many of the manually seeded faults did not align with the learning goals of the assignment, and several of those faults are difficult or impossible to reproduce as a reasonable modification of an implementation. We also followed an established methodology to determine whether a high mutation score is indicative of a high manually seeded fault detection rate independent of code coverage. More details about this methodology can be found in our paper, but our key finding here is that for every manually seeded fault, except for a few problematic ones in the sorting project, test suites that detect a particular fault will also in general have a higher mutation score than test suites that don't detect that fault. In answering research question 2, we collected mutation scores for every student test suite again, and additionally we simulated all pairs grading and collected the number of faulty student implementations detected by each student test suite. Note that this required us to use only assignments where students submitted test cases and implementations. Each point on these plots represents one student-written test suite. The x-axis shows the number of student implementations each test suite detected as faulty, and the y-axis shows the number of mutants detected. In the top two graphs, we see a moderately strong correlation between mutant detection and faulty student implementation detection, but we also see some deviations from this trend that we investigated further. Using a combination of manual source code inspection and augmenting the instructor-written test suite with test cases targeted at a single fault, we searched for faults in the student-written implementations that are not coupled to any mutants generated by the mutation analysis tool we used, which in this case was MUL. We then identified student implementations that contain only these not mutant coupled faults. We removed those implementations from the dataset and we replotted the graph. And in the bottom two graphs on this page, we see that removing those implementations strengthens the correlation in both cases, suggesting that the original correlation was mainly weakened by these not mutant coupled faults. We then examined these not mutant coupled faults in more detail to determine if they might suggest or reveal ways of improving existing mutation analysis tools. Out of hundreds of assignment submissions, we found only a fairly small number of unique not mutant coupled faults. About a third of these faults would have been coupled to a mutant generated with a mutation operator supported by a different mutation testing tool, but not by MUL. A few more would require a new or stronger mutation operator. Almost half of the game card faults would be coupled to a mutant generated with an existing mutation operator, but from a different implementation. And almost half of the game player faults can't be coupled to a mutant at all because of some fundamental flaw in the algorithm students chose, added logic, or incorrect assumptions about the invariance of the specification that they were to implement. To summarize our findings, 1. Mutants are a very good substitute for manually seeded faults. We saw a strong correlation between mutant detection and manually seeded fault detection on 4 out of 5 assignments. Generating mutants automatically can help avoid low-quality faults like the ones we saw in the sorting assignment. And second, mutants are a reasonably good proxy for all pairs test suite grading. Although the correlation between mutant detection and faulty student implementation detection wasn't as strong, this was mainly due to a small number of not mutant coupled faults that were unevenly distributed throughout the student implementations. That is, these faults were present in many more implementations than other faults. It's important to note that the uneven distribution of faults is a known drawback of all pairs grading. And additionally, the number of redundant mutants doesn't grow with the number of students, but the number of redundant faults in student code for all pairs grading does. Our study has implications for researchers, educators, and tool builders. Researchers may consider a line of work in which mutants are generated from multiple implementations instead of revisions of a single implementation. There's also a lot more potential research into using test suite quality metrics on student test suites. Educators may consider using mutation analysis tools to generate faults instead of seeding them by hand or using all pairs grading. It may be possible to get a more robust set of faults by generating mutants from multiple implementations. Educators may consider using mutation analysis tools to generate faults instead of seeding them by hand or using all pairs. It may be possible to get a more robust set of faults by generating mutants from multiple implementations. Educators might also investigate using mutation analysis outside of the assignment submission loop so that students can receive fast, frequent feedback on their test suites. Tool builders can look into providing better support for educational settings. For example, a mutant generation phase would make it easier for instructors to select which mutants they want to use to evaluate student test suites. While some ad hoc support for features like this is possible using JSON data generated by mutation analysis tools, first-class support would help further increase adoption. There are also potential use cases for generating mutants from multiple implementations or comparing mutation scores of multiple test suites. We look forward to engaging with the community in future work on these topics. Thank you.